Blackwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Fox,
Yes.
Councilmember Fowler,
Yes.
Councilmember Triplett,
Yes.
Councilmember Reed,
Yes.
Councilmember Winkler, Councilmember Winkler,
Yes.
Councilmember Parker,
Yes.
Councilmember Piagentini,
Yes.
Councilmember Benson,
Yes.
Councilmember George,
Yes.
Councilmember Engel,
Yes.
Councilmember Peden,
Yes.
Councilmember Flood, Councilmember Holton Stewart,
Yes.
Councilmember Ackerson.
Yes.
Mr. President, you have 24 yes votes, 1 abstention.
Thank you. The appointment passes. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 30, please.
The appointment of Stachel Boosie to the Civilian Review and Accountability Board. Term expires March 25th, 2022. Read in full.
Thank you. May I have a motion and a second?
So move Purvis.
A motion by Councilwoman Purvis, second by Councilwoman George. The appointment is before us. Is there any discussion? Councilman Ackerson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Reverend Boosie came out of the Government Accountability Committee with a favorable recommendation on a vote of 5-3.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today marks another step on our journey to improve public safety as we vote on the inaugural members of our new Civilian Review Board. This board will make recommendations that could have a profound effect on the lives of families throughout our community. Public safety is the foremost responsibility of our city government. Anyone tasked with influencing that function must be ready to accept and understand that just like the officers who serve this community, their decisions will lead to either a better community or larger divisions. For this reason, we take the vote on the Civilian Review and Accountability Board very seriously. Several members of this council have voiced our shared concern with 2 candidates for this board. We have had many conversations over the past week to gain understanding and seek out common ground. I am sure there will be many more difficult conversations to come as we tackle these critical issues. But I am consoled that each council person came to their decision based on their desire to improve our community and turn around the trend of violence as well as mistrust that currently exists on our streets. When this ordinance was passed, it purposely excluded many members of the public. Specifically, it excluded family members of any law enforcement personnel. Arguably, tens of thousands of citizens within our community were excluded because of an assumption of potential bias in favor of LMPD. While some of us disagreed with this decision, we supported the overall ordinance because we knew that it was needed and that the Metro Council would have the opportunity to review the mayor's nominations. The second whereas within the Civilian Review and Accountability Board ordinance calls for an objective and independent board. We have every reason to be concerned over the objectivity of the 2 appointments being voted on this evening. They haven't just made statements of political or philosophical disagreement. They have expressed their bias against police with multiple public statements made over the course of the past year. The role of this body is oversight, and the members of this council who are opposed to these 2 appointments believe in our hearts that despite the many wonderful things that these two appointees may do through their volunteer work, their bias violates the intention of the whereas clause which established this board. No matter our policy disagreements, as a country, as a state, and as a city, we must stop confusing those disagreements with violence. We can and should express our disagreements through words, and even from time to time, passionate words. That passion should never devolve into calls for physical violence against another member of this community, including threats that have been made against these candidates. Finally, no matter the result of these votes, we will all continue to pursue what we believe is the best direction for this city. That means we all pray for better days ahead and will work toward that goal. That means that each of us and our constituents will continue to advocate for the solutions they believe will make our city a great place to live, work, and play. We will all do this in the realm of ideas, rooted in a respect for our common humanity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilwoman Green.
Thank you, Mr. President. We know through painful experiences that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. White Americans must recognize that justice for Black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The reality of substantial investment to assist Negroes into the 20th century is still a nightmare for all too many white Americans. Good evening, colleagues. Did those comments shock and make you uncomfortable? Surprisingly to some of you all, these are the radical words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Yet, MLK's life has been filtered through a revisionist lens, but his radical legacy is a bomb in today's political climate. We look back through a framework where we are able to see Martin Luther King as a peaceful man of God because he was. He was also very much more than that, and he was radical for his time, and he is radical for our times. If there were Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Snapchat back in 1967, when our beloved King made these comments, what would each of you have said about Martin King's fitness when he submitted his application to the Citizens Review Board, or any board in Louisville for that matter? This board has been a long time coming. Our city and our country have spent the last year as ground zero in the 21st century civil rights movement. We as city leaders, we have talked, we have passed legislation, and supposedly listened and tried to understand why people are so angry. Reaching the goal of the CRB requires inviting those in the arena to the table. This is where the greatest opportunity exists to make the most gains. Yes, there are posts that were made, yet who amongst us wants to be reduced to any singular or even 5 social media concepts? I know that I don't want to be. It's a concept that should be applied to our colleagues as much as to these appointees. Reverend Bussey and Mr. Taylor are so much more than the posts that were pulled out about them. If you had looked further on Facebook, you would have seen Reverend Bussey celebrating the goodness of God by ministering to people and preaching, providing housing and food and toiletries to hundreds of houseless Louisvillians during the most recent inclement weather crisis, which, by the way, we as local government and elected officials failed to do. She bought a bus and mobilized protesters to deliver Halloween candy, Thanksgiving meals, and groceries to families throughout this pandemic. She has stated, "Anything I do, I look at what would Jesus do for real." She is quoted as saying, "You can't be a Christian, you can't serve Jesus without the conviction of justice." All of this can be found on social media with the simple click of a button. If we had combed through Mr. Taylor's social media accounts, you would see him acting as a voice of reason and a mediator when scary tensions arose between different factions last summer. You would know that he and his wife have dedicated their lives to being JCPS employees. You would have seen about how so many people speak about him being a kind and good man. And you would know that he's not speaking as a resident of West Louisville, as he resides in District 23. There is diversity in thought in our city, in our districts, and there should be on this board. I wonder if many of us who have had only positive experience with law enforcement and who speak about law enforcement in glowing terms would feel as if we were unsuitable for this board. I also want to just remind you all that a job in law enforcement is not a protected class. In the same way that people can say, "I hate lawyers," or "I hate Metro Council members," it is okay for people to speak about their experiences with law enforcement that are not positive. We want people who are empowered to speak about their experiences. Lastly, neither Reverend Bussey nor Mr. Taylor, just as Martin Luther King Jr., can or should be reduced to just a few statements that talk about their frustration with this system. They are so much more. The time to build bridges is now. John Lewis's initial crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge was met with violence and destruction on Bloody Sunday in 1965 when his head was cracked open by state troopers and he nearly died. But the story does not end there. Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, and President Johnson signed such an act into law on August 6, 1965. The message is that there is promise and possibility in using this board as a bridge over troubled water, and with us actively and boldly being bridge builders for the city that I know that we all love. This Citizens Review and Accountability Board can be just that. This board is not just about review, it is about accountability. There is no civilian review and accountability without Antonio Taylor and Stachelle Bussey. Please give these candidates and please give Louisville this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Green,
Yes.
Councilmember Shanklin,
Yes.
Councilmember Dorsey,
I'm not
Yes.
going to keep.
Councilmember Arthur,
Yes.
Councilmember Purvis,
Yes.
President James,
Yes.
Councilmember McCraney,
Yes.
Councilmember Armstrong,
Yes.
Councilmember Hollander,
Yes.
Councilmember Mulvihill,
Yes.
Councilmember Kramer,
No.
Councilmember Blackwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Fox,
No.
Councilmember Fowler,
No.
Councilmember Triplett,
Yes.
Councilmember Reed,
No.
Councilmember Winkler,
Yes.
Councilmember Parker,
No.
Councilmember Piagentini,
No.
Councilmember Benson,
No.
Councilmember George,
Yes.
Councilmember Engel,
No.
Councilmember Peden, Councilmember Flood, Councilmember Holton Stewart,
No.
Councilmember Ackerson.
Yes.
Mr. President, you have 15 yes votes and 10 no votes.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The appointment passes. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 31.
Appointment of Antonio Taylor to the Civilian Review and Accountability Board. Term expires March 25th, 2024. Read in full.
Thank you. May I have a motion and a second?
Motion Purvis.
Second, Arthur.
I have a motion by Councilwoman Purvis and a second by Councilman Winkler. The appointment is before us. Is there any discussion? Councilman Ackerson.
Thank you, Mr. President. This item came out of the Government Accountability Committee with a negative recommendation at a vote of 3 in favor and 5 not in favor.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, this appointment requires a roll call vote. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Green,
Yes.
Councilmember Shanklin,
Yes.
Councilmember Dorsey,
Yes.
Councilmember Arthur,
Yes.
Councilmember Purvis,
Yes.
President James,
Yes.
Councilmember McCraney,
Yes.
Councilmember Armstrong,
Yes.
Councilmember Hollander,
Yes.
Councilmember Mulvihill,
Yes.
Councilmember Kramer,
No.
Councilmember Blackwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Fox,
No.
Councilmember Fowler,
No.
Councilmember Triplett,
Yes.
Councilmember Reed,
No.
Councilmember Winkler,
Yes.
Councilmember Parker,
No.
Councilmember Piagentini,
No.
Councilmember Benson,
No.
Councilmember George,
Yes.
Councilmember Engel,
No.
Councilmember Peden, Councilmember Flood, Councilmember Holton Stewart.
No.
I'm sorry, ma'am, can you repeat that, please?
No.
Thank you. Councilmember Ackerson.
Yes.
Mr. President, you have 15 yes votes and 10 no votes.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The appointment passes. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 32.
A resolution overturning the decision of the Landmarks Commission designating the property located at 211 through 215 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard, case number 20 landmark 0001 in Louisville Metro as a local landmark. Read in full.
Thank you.
Motion to accept, Triplett.
Second, Piagentini.
Motion by Councilman Triplett and seconded by Councilman Piagentini. The resolution is before us. Is there any discussion? Councilman Reed.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the resolution regarding the Oddfellows building. And what we will be voting on tonight is the decision of the Landmarks Commission to designate that as a historic landmark. And I think Councilman Arthur would like to speak to this.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Arthur, I'm sorry.
Peace. As you all can see from our resolution, there's very clear and sufficient evidence that this is not a landmark. The commission's own report says that there's no specific individuals or events identified with this building and site. You can also call into question this criteria when we consider that the Oddfellows as an institution, as a national institution, had a whites-only clause until 1971. We also know that our ordinance requires sufficient integrity to be within this structure or within this district. The commission's own report also points to significant destructive fire that really destroyed the interior of the building. So at that point, since the 1980s, it has not remained in the same fashion that it was once when we considered it potentially historical. We also know that our commission said that it met criteria D that talks about the embodiment of a distinguishing characteristics, architectural type. It meets portions of D, allegedly, according to our planning commission, but it does not meet D in its entirety. And when we talk about the way that we interpret legislation, it's important for us to realize if you could meet portions of D, that would have been specified in the ordinance itself. Our ordinance says it has to meet criterion A, which we already called into question, and B through G, something B through G. It does not meet any of those. This building does not meet the required criteria, and it actually contradicts the required criteria. You could say any of these letters. You can't say that it embodies distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type when all of that burned in a fire over 30 years ago. You can't say that this is the work of an architect, a landscape architect, or master builder whose individual work has significantly influenced the development of this city when he wasn't even significant enough for us to find proof that he built it. And you can't say that it has character, interest, or value as a part of the development or the heritage of this city as if it's historical when we all know that it was on the wrong side of history. We have historic landmarks in this city, but this whites-only fellows building is not one of them. That's why I'm voting yes to overturn the landmark decision, and I'm encouraging my colleagues to vote yes as well.
Thank you, Councilman. Is there any further discussion? Councilwoman McCraney?
Sir.
No. Oh, Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I just thank you, Councilman Arthur. I think he spelled out the case beautifully. I'm going to be in support of this resolution overturn this designation because of all those reasons. But I do want to address a broader thing, which is not the reason I'm voting to overturn it, but maybe a broader commentary for the Landmarks Commission. And this has been said before, but I think it needs to be said again clearly. And that is, we need proactivity related to these landmarks decisions. It is, I don't want to speak for everybody else, but I know that I'm not the only one that is frustrated to see landmarks decisions come at the 11th hour when there's development or other decisions that are being made simultaneously. If we have landmarks across the city, I would ask the Landmarks Commission to proactively start designating them now, right? Don't wait until there is a deal penned, pending deal penned, some other purchase agreement happening or have happened in order to take that action. And then that compounded by the case that Councilman Arthur just put forward tells me that this was rushed, which is not the intention of what this commission is supposed to be doing. So I would just ask publicly that the Landmarks Commission please follow the legislative intent, which is to be proactive in the designation, to follow the guidance, which I think was missed in both cases here, which is why I'm going to be joining my colleague in voting to overturn this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman McCraney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, for the benefit of the public, I would like someone to speak to the sale of the Oddfellows building. Can someone please address the fact that the building was sold? And I don't know if someone protested or had it designated before the sale, but we need to speak publicly about that because I have a lot of constituents who are very much concerned about this being a designated landmark, but not understanding the fact that it has been sold and what activity took place before the sale of this building. Can someone speak to that, please?
President, I know I'm a few months in, but I could speak to it just really, really briefly.
Thank you.
Just to paint a quick timeline, our city, including Louisville Forward, including other agencies from Metro government, signed a contract in December 2014. And at that point, the Omni owned the building. A lot of people are throwing out a whole lot of ideas about what we should do and what we shouldn't do. We don't own this building. And I don't think anyone on this call or anyone across the city wants someone to just take your property. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about this, but we need to talk about the facts. We do not own this building. And then not only do we not own the building, we turned around and landmarked it, considering like decades after the fact when it could have been landmarked. If this was a historical landmark, how come we didn't have this discussion, I don't know, in the 60s when the National Preservation Act was passed? How come we didn't have this conversation in the 70s when our own board of aldermen decided they were going to start landmarking buildings? How come we didn't have this conversation until 2019, years after the Omni had already purchased this lot and this land? The ink is dry. And it's very concerning to me that we have a whole lot of people across this city, a whole lot of people who don't understand the pain that segregation has caused the city of Louisville, who are asking me and others to save a building that I couldn't even go into 50, 60 years ago. So I just wanted to let that be known, really show the facts that we do not own it. So whether or not we decide it's a historic landmark, that fact does not change.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman McCraney, did that answer your question?
It did, but I want to be clear in that we do not own that building. And if it was not designated a historic building before we sold it, and if no one fought for it before it was sold, I don't see why we have any say in the matter at this moment. It is not a racial issue, as some would like for it to be, and as some are trying for me to be involved in for a discussion. For me, it is pure and simply the fact that we don't own this building and it was sold by the city to the Omni. How can we, in good faith, go back and take care of a building that we don't own? That is my issue, and that is what I want the community to clearly understand. If you sold your house, you cannot go back to that property and tell them they can't paint the outside of the building. You can't regulate what they do to that building once you have sold it. That is where we are, and that's the decision that I will be making when I cast my vote, based on those facts alone.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman George?
Thank you, President. Metro has a robust network of citizens who are willing to serve on boards and commissions, and it is not uncommon for a landmark commissioner to spend upwards of 7 hours a month to serve. I'm a process person, and this debate is important. It has certainly sparked a lot of questions about whose history is recognized and how we do that. But I want to remind everyone that if we don't like the composition of the commission as specified in the ordinance, we have the ability to change it. If we don't like the criteria that's set to establish a landmark, we have the ability to change it. What we shouldn't do is arbitrarily undermine decisions that have been made by a commission, a broad commission, because we don't like them in the moment. Personally, I believe we should encourage and incentivize reuse of historic structures. We should support planning that promotes granular urbanism that maximizes interest and accessibility to development, rather than potential dead space, which is often created in our urban areas. But this isn't about what I think. I ask my colleagues to consider the value of the process that we have and to work to change it where needed. I'm happy to work on changes as relates to the process. No doubt we need real conversations and commitment around racial reconciliation, but it shouldn't come at the additional cost of a historic structure and our vibrancy of our downtown. So for that reason, I'll be a no. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And Councilman Hollander?
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to explain my vote. As I said in committee, I believe that this does meet the two criteria, A and D. I think D clearly has a number of different ways in which D can be met, and I think it does meet one. The particular reference to the master architect, as again I said in committee, I thought was inappropriate, but I think the other way of meeting D was met here. I agree with Councilwoman George, and I would just point out that our ordinance is set up so that buildings can be designated as landmarks that are not owned by Metro government. I would like to see that done earlier in the process, but I would also point out in connection with this particular building, which is being designated not because of what occurred in the building, but because of the architectural type. In the case of this particular building, there was testimony at the Landmarks Commission that there wasn't an earlier effort at the time this discussion was happening to declare this a landmark because of statements that were made by Omni about this building. I went back, and the first meeting that I had in Metro Council was in January of 2015. I was on a special committee, and I asked Mike Smith, who was the Senior Vice President of Real Estate and the General Counsel of TRT Holdings, which is the parent company of Omni, about the properties on this site. And I want to read what he said. The Park building, that's the building we're talking about because Park was located there at the time. The Park building down on towards Muhammad Ali is going to stay. It will stay, until further plans are determined for that future development parcel, the 1 acre site down there. And as we look at it, we've talked about a lot of things that may incorporate that into it. It may not, but it very well may. I mean, the building is in pretty good shape. The testimony at the Landmarks Commission where those same statements were made to people who wanted to preserve that building, and they didn't do it because they thought that there would be discussions and that Omni was interested. And as was said to me, that it will stay until there is a plan for that future development site. There is no plan now. No plans have been filed for this site. The plan is to tear it down and have a vacant lot. And that seems to me inappropriate for a building of this type, and that's why I'll be voting no on this ordinance.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Chambers Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will also be a no vote for many of the reasons articulated by Councilman Hollander and Councilwoman George, and I just want to explain why. I do believe that our city, it has a long history that it must confront, including longstanding segregation and redlining. And I want to be very clear, we should not be honoring relics to slavery or segregation. Our landmarks ordinance already sets out criteria to preserve landmarks significant to historically marginalized communities. That's a good thing. I think it's likewise essential that we develop criteria for how to contextualize relics to enslavement, segregation, and discrimination. And our community needs to determine as a public what we should do about those landmarks. That way we are evaluating each proposal in an equitable manner, and the Landmarks Commission is able to weigh in at the earliest stage. An ad hoc discussion at the council level without evidence that it has been fully vetted or allowed to be scrutinized by the public or the expert landmark commission is not the way for this important conversation to happen. However, I hope that this matter will lead to an important conversation around our land use policies in the future. So I will be voting no tonight, but I'm looking forward to ongoing conversation with other members of council. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Arthur.
Peace. I'll make this as short as possible. I just wanted to point out what Councilman Bill Hollander said and say that the Omni also said something about a grocery store. And if you believed what they said, then you got bamboozled. But I don't care about the he said, she said. Let's talk about what's in the contract. The contract says that that parcel must be cleared. The contract says they will acquire this land and that Metro has to clear that parcel for them when they decide what to do with it. They said what they wanted to do with it. They notified this government, this body, and people still decided to landmark it. To a certain extent, that's not my fault. That's not my problem. As Councilwoman Paula McCraney pointed out, we do not own it. Some people are talking about a waste of money, $400,000 plus. This council approved of a budget to really get disposition of the building, and that means either demolish it or you can move it. Jeff O'Brien from Louisville Forward shared that it costs double at least to move this structure. So if the concern is about the land, we don't own the land for the 1 millionth time. If the concern is about the building, then maybe some of the people who are concerned would be willing to siphon up some of their money and they can help move the building. But we did not allocate any funds, at least enough funds to move the building. I think fiscal year 20, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I'll also add that it's very strange that we have a community of people fighting so hard to save a building as opposed to fighting to dismantle the systems that were created by some of the segregationists who utilized this building. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, this is a resolution that would normally be a voice vote, but I'm sure there's going to be opposition, so we're going to do a roll call vote. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Green? Yes. That was yes, correct? Yes. Councilmember Shanklin?
Yes.
Councilmember Dorsey?
Yes.
Councilmember Arthur?
Yes.
Councilmember Purvis?
Yes.
President James?
Yes.
Councilmember McCraney?
Yes.
Councilmember Armstrong?
No.
Councilmember Hollander?
No.
Councilmember Mulvihill?
No.
Councilmember Kramer?
Yes.
Councilmember Blackwell?
Yes.
Councilmember Fox?
Yes.
Councilmember Fowler?
Yes.
Councilmember Triplett?
Yes.
Councilmember Reed?
Yes.
Councilmember Winkler?
No.
Councilmember Parker?
Yes.
Councilmember Piagentini?
Yes.
Councilmember Benson?
Yes.
Councilmember George?
No.
Councilmember Engel?
Yes.
Councilmember Peden?
Yes.
That was a yes. Councilmember Flood? Councilmember Holton Stewart?
Yes.
Councilmember Ackerson?
Yes.
Mr. President, you have 20 yes votes and 5 no votes.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The resolution passes. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 33, please.
A resolution creating a new section of Chapter 35 of the Louisville Metro Code of Ordinances requiring the implementation of paid family leave amended by substitution, read in full.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. May I have a motion and a
Motion,
second?
Piagentini.
Second, Fox.
Motion by Councilman Piagentini, seconded by Councilman Fox. The ordinance is before us. Is there any discussion? Councilwoman Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to say that this is a pivotal piece of legislation for Louisville Metro and its employees. This is something that definitely puts family first. I always say putting our money literally where our mouth is. When we promote, advocate for family, living wage, and equity, this is an ordinance that does just that internally, which means we start in our own backyard, and that's how we truly lead. I want to thank my co-sponsor, Councilwoman George, as well as Councilwoman Green, Councilman Piagentini, and Councilwoman Chambers Armstrong for working through this. I will let them join in and take us through any summaries of what the legislation outlines. But I just want to say I am proud of this legislation that has come out of committee. And I want to turn it back over to anyone who wants to speak or summarize the legislation. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman Dorsey. Councilwoman Armstrong Chambers?
Sure, I'm happy to provide a brief summary of the legislation. It provides 12 weeks of paid leave for Metro employees who are growing their families through birth or adoption. It also provides 2 weeks for families of circumstance through either foster leave or kinship care, which I think is a really important equity piece. I'm really glad that we were able to work that in as the legislation moved. I think at this point, I hope that we're all aware of the many benefits that are associated with paid leave in terms of actual sort of medical outcomes. It leads to better health outcomes for women, for families, for children. It also decreases turnover in the workplace. It increases productivity whenever employees and family members do return to work. It's also an equity issue, as we know that paid leave is tied to decreased infant mortality rates and that we have higher infant mortality rates in our Black communities. So it's an important way that we can begin to tackle some of these issues that are so important to so many of us. Additionally, it's also associated with decreased risk of sudden infant death syndrome. Beyond the numbers, which I am happy to talk about with anyone that wants to talk about them, I think there's been a lot of discussion about how the fiscal note might overestimate the cost. We know that Nashville, which has approximately 3 to 4 times the number of city employees that we do, implemented paid parental leave and medical leave at a cost of $2.8 million, which is much less than what our fiscal note would estimate for our more limited parental leave with fewer employees. Additionally, I think there's been lots of discussion about the way that it was calculated. But I do want to say, just beyond the numbers, I think that this is truly the right thing to do for our Metro employees, as Councilwoman Dorsey so eloquently said. If we say that we value working families, we must lead with that value and truly put our money where our mouth is and value our working families. We must be the type of employer that we want the other businesses in our city to be. And we have to take concrete, tangible steps to set children and families up for success from the beginning. And paid leave is one of the most effective ways that data has shown that we can do that. So I will be a proud yes vote tonight. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first just want to thank the other co-sponsors for, as my schedule is very difficult, given my day job and all that, Councilwoman George and Dorsey and Chambers Armstrong, Councilwoman Green included me through the process and sort of worked with me as much as possible. And I, first of all, want to say I really appreciate that. I am supporting this as well. And look, to be clear, right, there was even a committee amendment I put forward that didn't pass, right? You know, once again, it's one of those circumstances in complex pieces of legislation like this. It's never exactly how you have it in your head, but this is a 26-member committee, and I see, and you know, I think we got this to a great place that was very similar to what the federal government did, bluntly, under the Trump administration this past before the Biden administration took office. I think it's important to align to other experience like that when you can, and I appreciate our flexibility in the amendments to get it sort of there. It's no secret that I'm a pro-life legislator, and that means that I take very seriously policies that promote family, that promote children, and that prioritize them in our work life and in our personal lives. And you know, particularly once we saw the Nashville numbers and all, and I didn't have that just for my caucus members. I didn't, you know, Councilwoman Chambers Armstrong just got that at the 11th hour, so I didn't have that during the caucus meeting. But that helps clarify some of the comments I made where the financial impact is much smaller than what some of the original estimates were from OMB. And again, no hit on OMB. They were making a lot of assumptions. But you know, what I'll tell you from my personal experience, I was able to get about 6 weeks of paid leave when my daughters were adopted. And bluntly, when I came back, I was a zombie for about another 4 to 6. Just because of sleep and everything else that was going on. So if anybody thinks that, you know, bringing somebody back at 4 to 6 weeks, right, you know, get back to work, if we think we're getting full productivity out of those people, you know, it's not happening. I lived that experience and I know it's not true. With that said, I think this is a great overall policy. It promotes family. It will assist with a benefit structure that's pro-young employee and hopefully encourage them to stick around. And so I'm in favor of this. Glad to also answer any questions, but I would encourage everybody else to please approve this ordinance. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Parker.
Yes, thank you. being from the medical community background, I would have liked to have seen this maybe some compromise in between basically what the medical community offers, which is 4 weeks paid leave and spousal 4 weeks paid leave. By federal mandate, anyone can take off for 12 weeks, and you get that as a benefit. We don't really know what the cost of this is going to be, even if it's, say, only $3 million in the overall scheme of things. People are going to do what they want to do for their families anyway. So I just think it's a jump between 4 weeks, which is what happens in the professional medical community, to 12 weeks. And I know that the sponsors, they're going off of what the federal government did, which has been mentioned before, happened under the Trump administration. And I think it was actually Ivanka Trump that championed this and helped push it through. But I would have liked to have seen maybe 8 weeks. And because government workers, they get a lot of benefits as far as vacation time, sick time, and I know it's mentioned over and over again, government workers don't get paid as much as private sector workers do. But when you add up the benefits and the time off and the early retirement, a lot of government workers, they only work maybe a quarter of their life, and the other 50% of their life, they're on a pension. And you add all that up, it's a lot more than what most people in the private sector get. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm voting against it. I am voting for it, and I really appreciate looking out for foster parents, because we need foster parents so much. And that's the best part of this legislation that I truly appreciate, because I think that's really, as far as community, that's really going to help more than anything else. And I will say also, working in the medical profession, nobody gets hired because of maternity leave, and nobody typically leaves because of maternity leave. It is a nice perk. But all that being said, I will vote yes, but I just wanted to relay my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And Councilwoman George.
Thank you, President. I've spent my career working in government, watching dedicated employees start their careers with great energy and enthusiasm, only to struggle with less competitive salaries, overwhelming workloads, and all the while trying to balance the needs of their families. While I've also seen many of those same employees ultimately leave work in government to take a job that pays better benefits and has better salaries. And so this ordinance offers the opportunity to inspire the health of our workforce and their families, and will translate into positive outcomes, creating enhanced city services for all. Several co-sponsors wanted to mention and recognize the work of former Councilman Cone, who really did the heavy lifting to draft and introduce this ordinance last year. But I also want to say that this legislation marks somewhat of a different approach that has been taken. And I want to recognize the co-sponsors who worked collaboratively to get us to a better product. To Councilwoman Parker's point, there was lots of compromise that took place. Personally, I would have loved to have seen more time for our families of circumstance, but as it was, we have a stronger product that will hopefully both inspire health as well as ensure fiscal responsibility. And so for that, I'm a proud sponsor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Is there any further discussion? Madam Clerk, could you please list me as a co-sponsor, please? Hearing no further discussion, Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Green.
Yes.
Councilmember Shanklin,
Yes.
Councilmember Dorsey,
Yes.
Councilmember Arthur,
Yes.
Councilmember Purvis,
Yes.
President James,
Yes.
Councilmember McCraney,
Yes.
Councilmember Armstrong,
Yes.
Councilmember Hollander,
Yes.
Councilmember Mulvihill,
Yes.
Councilmember Kramer,
Yes.
Councilmember Blackwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Fox,
Yes.
Councilmember Fowler,
Yes.
Councilmember Triplett,
Yes.
Councilmember Reed, Councilmember Winkler,
I see his background, but I don't see his image.
Yes.
Councilmember.
Sorry. Yes.
No, thank you, sir. Councilmember Parker. Councilmember Piagentini.
Yes.
Councilmember Benson.
Yes.
Councilmember George.
Yes.
Councilmember Engel.
Yes.
Councilmember Peden.
Madam Clerk, may I be a co-sponsor as well, please? And I vote yes.
Councilmember Flood. Councilmember Holton Stewart.
Yes.
Councilmember Ackerson.
Yes.
Mr. President, you have 25 yes votes.
Thank you, and the ordinance passes. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 34, please.
An ordinance creating a chapter of the Louisville Jefferson County Metro Government Code of Ordinances, LMCO, to prevent the unauthorized publication of individuals' personally identifying information in a practice commonly known as doxing, as amended, read in full.
Thank you.
Approval, Peden.
Motion by Councilman Peden, second by Councilman Reed. The ordinance is before us. Is there any discussion? Councilwoman Green.
Thank you, Mr. President. The primary sponsors on this ordinance are Councilman Piagentini and Councilman Winkler. This item passed out of committee with a favorable vote with 4-3, and it's on old business for us to all discuss today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Is there any discussion? Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Councilman Green. So, colleagues, this is new territory, okay? So I first want to thank everybody that contributed to this, everybody that asked questions over a couple committee meetings and privately to help sort of form this and challenge it. I want to thank Jason Fowler, specifically in the county attorney's office, who did months of research preparing what is a very, which is a very important issue of our time, and that is for government to keep up with the changing times and technology. First, let me attempt to address what this bill does and then what it absolutely does not do, and hopefully that'll clarify things for folks. And then I'll address a few of the objections we had and then answer any questions. But number one, what does this not do? This is not an attack on free speech. People can get online on any social media platform and tell me how terrible I am all the live long day, okay? This has no impact on that. This has no impact on somebody that shares mine or anybody in this community's personally identifiable information. That is not addressed in this, or that is not criminalized through this ordinance. What this ordinance does is if somebody on a public platform combines the two things, right? So it takes personally identifiable information, things like your home address, and hosts a reasonable threat, and not something even that they think is a reasonable threat, something that a reasonable person determined by a judge would determine as a threat, that in combination on social media would be defined as doxing. And the penalty here is a fine of $250 per day that post is up. The gap in the law currently, if I post somebody's personally identifiable information and I say I will do something, right? I will assault somebody. That falls under the terroristic threatening ordinances and is punishable. The gap that LMPD and the County Attorney's Criminal Division identified is if somebody says, Councilman Piagentini lives at, gives my home address, and somebody should, and it would be terrible if, and somebody puts, think of the most horrible violence that they would be encouraging in the rest of that statement, to myself or to my immediate family, my wife and my daughters. Currently, there is nothing that law enforcement or the prosecutor's office can do about that. And that can be shared far and wide. That is what this is addressing. What this basically says is that combination of those two things is no longer protected speech. Therefore, it is no longer protected speech for anyone. The genesis of this started when we had a member of this city government here in Chambers testifying at a government accountability meeting last year about their role in an investigation we were doing about the place-based investigative unit. That employee talked about threats made to their person, made to their home, and it was heartbreaking. No employee, whether I agree with what they're doing or I don't agree with what they're doing, but no employee, no citizen of this community, regardless of my disagreements with them, regardless of whether I think what they're doing is right and just or not, should be subject to that level of terror in their home, in their private life. And that is what this seeks to address. There has been an amendment to this. As you can see, this is as amended. I want to thank Councilman Arthur. I also want to thank the ACLU. Councilman Arthur brought this up in committee, and the ACLU emailed Councilman Winkler and I and asked for two amendments. One is what we have addressed, and that is interacting with a post that is in violation of this. So let's say somebody posts and says, okay, somebody lives at such and such address, and it would be terrible if, and they write some terrible violence, and you're in violation. If you interact with that post, that is not in violation with this ordinance. And by interact, I mean like, comment, or do anything in that platform that interacts with the post. If you republish, think, copy, paste, you are now in violation of the ordinance because now you're sharing it with your network. Okay. So that was one amendment made that was asked by Councilman Arthur, brought that up in committee. It was a great point. The ACLU asked, so we made that amendment. The only other thing that was asked by the ACLU, but we talked in length about this with the county attorney's office with Councilman Winkler, is there is a portion of this where we identify examples of personally identifiable information. There is language in there that does say including but not limited to, and we list several examples. They wanted us to identify every possible piece of personally identifiable information and eliminate the including but not limited to. That would be bordering on impossible. I mean, you could think of a scenario where if I didn't mention, well, Councilman Piagentini goes to the Krispy Kreme on such and such street at 9 a.m. every day, and somebody should do X. The amount of scenarios we would have to play out is almost innumerable. So we didn't think that was reasonable, and the law does allow, and it's very common that you use including but not limited to provide guidance to the judicial system from the legislative branch, and meanwhile, acknowledge you can't assume every scenario that exists on earth. With that, I want to thank the county attorney's office. Want to thank Councilman Winkler for his assistance and support of this. Everybody else that contributed with ideas, glad to answer any questions, and I'm looking for everybody's support. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilwoman Green.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm staunchly against this ordinance. I do not believe that it will pass constitutional muster. I also believe that we are looking for a problem that is already covered by existing law. Direct threats are already covered by the terroristic threatening statute or harassing communications. Other threats can be covered through a civil process like an IPO, interpersonal order, and district court, which is a civil restraining order. Violation of these orders can actually result in incarceration, which is a much stronger standard than we have considered here. Government overreach in the areas of free speech, something that I'm very concerned about. I do not believe that we have the ability to be able to apply this law. How can we apply this law when there is a requirement of jurisdiction? and that it has to be in Louisville Metro. If someone says, oh, I was in Shively, or I was in Middletown, or I was in Clarksville when I made this post, that was maybe a threat, but not really a threat, are we saying that we now have the resources for our department to become the cyber sleuths, be able to determine the locations of where these statements are posted from? We live in a city where we have not spent the full amount of time and resources to be able to even prosecute sex crimes against children on the internet, where predators prey on our baby and where child porn is posted. And we've told these families that we don't have the resources to be able to actively prosecute these cases, but somehow we're able to be able to prosecute this. We cannot. Additionally, the sponsors are very clear that this is not a direct threat. As I said, direct threats are already covered by state law. It is about a subjective idea of what kind of amounts to a threat. I believe this may be simply posturing to a base without completely thinking about the legality or the application of this ordinance. And so for those reasons, I will be a strong no. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Arthur.
Peace. I just wanted to speak to the ACLU's concerns, as well as some concerns that I amplified. I'm glad that there was some clarification on the social media side as far as republishing and reposting. But I want to be very clear about the way that social media works. And of course, this is ever changing, so it might change over time. When you like something, when you comment on something, when you engage with something, social media has algorithms that will then rank it higher in news feeds, make it more visible for people. So this is indirectly republishing. And I have concerns about us creating something that is based on an ever-changing system, social media, the internet. That's the first point I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make and really name and just really amplify is the fact that the personally identifying information is not finite. And that really opens the door for someone to be charged for a crime that they didn't know was a crime, because we have this list, and then we also say it's not limited to this list. And then the last point I wanted to really just bring up, kind of what Councilwoman Jessica Green just mentioned about capacity. We know that this will need to be enforced. And I talked with Councilman Piagentini earlier about the process of enforcement. And I have concerns about us being able to enforce something that when you compare what's already being enforced and already being taken care of or not taken care of, you know, we have a police department that's struggling to solve homicides. And if they can't do that, or they're struggling to do that, how are we going to extend their capacity by chasing people on the internet who may or may not be within this jurisdiction? So I just wanted to express those concerns. I don't know to what extent we can address them here or back in committee or what, but I just wanted to lay that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilwoman George.
Thank you, President. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues, Councilman Green and Councilman Arthur said, but I do feel it's important just to state for the record that while I do understand that there is a problem to be solved here, I'm not convinced that it can be done through this legislation or maybe even any legislation. And it's not from a good effort made on behalf of Councilman Piagentini, because I certainly appreciate the work he's done. For me, this has lacked clarity from the beginning around core components, such as what it means to have a serious threat, what reasonable fear means, and intent. How do we measure intent? And if I can't clearly explain that to folks and with good faith around what that looks like, I can't in good conscience support this. I believe it's a setup, not just in the way of who might be perpetrating, but also a setup in the way of the discretion that it leaves in the way of interpretation and application. And so for those reasons, I will be a no tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And Councilman Hollander.
Thank you, Mr. President. I won't repeat the concerns either. I think that this has a substantial possibility of prohibiting and chilling non-threatening speech. I do not believe it is constitutional. I have grave concerns about just the language in the offense section. I think on its face, it's unconstitutional. And you have to try to make it constitutional, you have to go to the findings and intent section. And I'm very, very uncomfortable that we're asking law enforcement authorities to not just read the offense, but also go to the intent, which is the only place we really mention unlawful violence. I think I understand the concern here but I am very concerned about the vagueness of the ordinance. I particularly am concerned about what Councilman Arthur mentioned, the lack of clarity as to what is personally identifying information. I think this is very treacherous ground for us. And I think it's why very, very, very few jurisdictions have passed something like this because of the constitutional problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Reed?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be really brief. I think this probably will be directed more to Councilman Piagentini because I've heard repeatedly that enforcement of this is problematic. So did you consider that, and how would you explain to your colleagues the enforcement aspect of this?
Yeah, all I would say is we consulted both the LMPD and the county attorney's office, their criminal division, right? And in both cases, they were very clear that this is a gap, right? That they aren't doing anything. They've seen these types of threats. They exist. They've been out there, and that they've been willing but unable to do anything because of existing law. As Councilman Hollander just said, there are other jurisdictions who have done things like this. We read through all of those to see which were stronger than others, which were more realistic than others, and which came as close as possible to passing a constitutional muster. So, but as far as the law enforcement side of this, all the law enforcement agencies that were responsible for enforcing this indicated that there was a willingness to address this issue because there have been very credible threats made. And frankly, social media folks, right, aren't stupid. They know what they're doing. They know that gap exists. So they make very credible threats, but use very small terms like, it would be terrible if, it would suck if, and then throw the most horrible, violent actions behind that statement as possible. And because they have those few words before that, no matter how credible that threat is, both the county attorney's office and LMPD indicated they haven't been able to do anything about that. So I hope that helps answer your question.
It does. And, my feeling is that, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm especially not a constitutional lawyer, but if there's a chance that this passes constitutional muster, then we should try it. We should do it, because this is a situation where people really are being threatened, and to do nothing, I think, is the wrong approach. So I will be in support of this, and I do really appreciate all the work that Councilman Piagentini and Councilman Winkler put into this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilman Ackerson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Folks, I've got some real concerns here. If someone's going to make a threat, we have terroristic threatening laws out there. It carries with a criminal prosecution. This has no criminal prosecution. This has a $250 fine. If the concern is that these people on the internet are clever about getting around things, wording things in a manner that avoids the terroristic threatening charge, then clearly they're going to be avoiding the $250 fine here also. Because what we're going to do is we're going to leave it to the prosecutor's office or the police department to determine intent. It falls way short. And if it's what they're doing is wrong, then why are we allowing other people to hit likes? Well, maybe they're not sharing, but they're hitting likes and they're showing support for allegedly this threat. It doesn't make sense at all. If this is something that needs to be dealt with, it needs to be dealt with out of Frankfurt, and it needs to come with a lot of clarity, and it needs to come with criminal prosecution attached to it. But I think it's already covered by the terroristic threatening laws that we have out there. If folks are worried about threats, I hope that a number of the folks in this council that are worried about threats will take a look at, as we heard tonight, the safety zone. There's actual threats, and there's something that hasn't been done that can be done. And so for all those reasons, I'm going to be a no vote. And I'll conclude by saying this also. Councilman Hollander raised a great issue there, and that is the chilling effect. If someone wants to be critical of things, I don't want to scare them off from being critical. Now, of course, I don't want them saying they're going to go shoot somebody or they're going to kill somebody. That's wrong. But if they want to say, damn Brent Ackerson, and say, here's where he lives, go to his house and tell him, damn Brent Ackerson, that's good. That's fine. And in fact, we want to encourage criticism of society and criticism of people in public life. That comes with a job. And so, I'm protected. Other folks are protected already by the current criminal statutes on the books. I think this takes things way too far, misses the mark. And ultimately, if we want to be talking protection of citizens of Louisville, we ought to be spending our time talking about the buffer zones and safety zones and not internet posting. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Pete.
Thank you. I'm going to be a yes vote tonight. I have the same concerns as everyone else regarding First Amendment items, but, and I can sit, and I had a conversation earlier today with a council person about people want to come and stand on my front yard, and call me names, that's fine. And I can stand here and be bigger and uglier than everyone and act like I got a lot of bravado. But my yes vote tonight is for my wife and my 2 daughters that are at home alone, who are out with me when we go to restaurants, who have to carry that Peden name around, which, after 18 years in office can't be easy anymore. And that's the group I'm voting yes for. And yeah, it may not make it, if there's court challenges and so on, but anything I can do to protect them, their well-being, their sense of peace, I'm going to do that. And, that's kind of the price they pay for being the family of an elected official. But that's the group I'm thinking of. It's not even me, it's them. So.
Thank you. And Councilwoman Chambers Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will also be in no vote tonight, and I don't want to repeat a lot of what's been said. I have done a lot of First Amendment cases as an attorney. I think that this clearly violates the First Amendment. Doxing is bad. I appreciate the effort to try to stop doxing. People shouldn't dox each other. However, this type of ordinance, courts have been considering conduct on the internet. The Sixth Circuit has just put out a lot of guidance on how we should be thinking about these things. This ordinance as written is clearly susceptible to a number of facial and as-applied challenges that I don't think it would withstand. And so for that reason, I'm going to be a no vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. And Councilman Arthur.
Peace. I just wanted to add that when I originally heard about this, I was supportive for what it was introduced to me as throughout last year, throughout my life, but really throughout last year, I was doxxed. I was threatened. I had my property damaged. I had someone try to break into my home. I was in danger. So I totally reasoned with everything that was presented to me as you identify where someone is and you pose a threat or you allude to a threat. Absolutely. But the ordinance as written goes way beyond that. And that's very problematic. It gets into some very slippery slopes. So I just wanted to let that be known. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to clarify a few things for my colleagues. I appreciate everybody's feedback. First of all, I've been open to any suggestion to improve this. And again, other than those that I cited, I didn't receive any other feedback on how to improve this or tighten up the language. First of all, I think Councilman Hollander already said this. Other cities have this. I will say, I would be happy that we don't have to address this. I am praying for the day that some combination of the states, the federal government, and the courts address this so we don't have to. But this is an opportunity in a very, very, very tightly tailored way to start moving the issue forward and have the discussion and the debate. I want to address a couple of things that were brought up. Number one, this is not, anybody that indicates that somebody could say, go to so-and-so's address and damn that person, that would be not in violation of this ordinance. It's very clear that it's using words, and you can see this in the intent, that constitute true threats. True threats are that definition Jason Fowler from the County Attorney's Office established in committee, that this is a definition that's been used in many laws. The court system has a definition to that. And so this is not something that it doesn't have, or the language in the ordinance doesn't have plenty of background and jurisprudence to it. So it is not designed to be a scenario where somebody says, hey, let's go to his house and yell at that person or whatever. That clearly is not in violation of this. And the other thing is the amendment that we made about interaction, right? I'm going to read it here because I think it's worded in a very well-defined way to protect, even no matter what the social media platform does related to that post, it would not be taken as republishing. It says, notwithstanding the provisions cites the U.S. Code, individuals shall not be found to republish an information content provider when the original content is unaltered and remains within one interactive computer service system. So if you didn't change the content, no matter how that content moved, right? If you didn't change it and it retains within that interactive computer system, it's not republishing. So we were trying to be very, very explicit that there's no interaction with it in any system that exists currently, and that any that we could imagine, right, because of how those algorithms work, that would put them at risk for being in violation of this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilwoman George.
Thank you, President. I just wanted to clarify, we keep using the word threat to describe where the gap is. But what I heard Jason Fowler testify to before public safety was that specific threats are covered by terroristic threatening. And what doxing is really about is implied intimidation. So threats versus implied intimidation. Implied intimidation seems much more broad. And for that reason, I'm a no.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilwoman Parker?
Yes, I would like to ask the county attorney for some clarification between what is the main difference between a terroristic threat and a threat with doxing issues included. Can you have a terroristic threat without, and it be considered a terroristic threat without any identifying information coming forthwith from the threatener?
Thank you for the question, Councilwoman. Jason Fowler on behalf of the county attorney. Legislating around the First Amendment is difficult. As the debate has occurred, I've sat here with no small amount of trepidation, but the law on the books regarding terroristic threatening is designed for crimes that are expressed by one person to another. In other words, I say to someone, I am going to murder you. That is a defined threat. And Councilwoman George is correct. The jurisprudence around this is not specific threats, but intimidation. We are a government that has an interest in providing its citizens a community free from intimidation from one person to another. And that's the doctrine that underpins this law. It's not protected speech. It's outside the First Amendment's protection, one of 9 categories that aren't protected, and that is true threat. So there's some confusion between the terms. The doctrine that underpins this is something called true threats, but really what the court's looking at is intimidating language. And that's not covered in our current law. As Councilman Piagentini has described, there's a gap between someone very expressly threatening someone and someone conveying intimidating language that a reasonable person would consider to be a threat. That's the way the ordinance is written to address that gap between a very express threat and the intimidating language used to convey what a reasonable person would consider a threat. And I'm happy to provide any further clarification if I can. Thank you.
To me, this ordinance seems, you said it addresses the gap. This ordinance to me seems like it addresses threats, it addresses intimidation, and it addresses publishing a person's private. In addition to that, it makes it threefold. It publishes their identifying information, which makes that threat much easier for someone to act on. I mean, I would hate it if how would some of us members feel if someone put our social security number out there? I mean, you just wouldn't want this to happen I wouldn't want this to happen to any one of us. And I know people that have had, to hire security guards and have to move because of some of this stuff. I know a young girl that went through a very similar situation as what we're describing, and she had to have, her company had to hire security for her to come to and from work, and security at work and security at her home. So, I just think that the times that we are living in, this is important more now than ever, and I will be a yes vote.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Blackwell.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I had a question. Councilman Piagentini already addressed the one with Councilman Ackerson's example, that Councilman Ackerson's example of saying, here's his address, go give him, go protest or whatever, would not be covered. But I am a little confused with the example that Councilwoman Parker just used. So if you could still, can you still publish that person's address as long as you don't have the implied threat, right? So you can have it as long as you don't say, and it would be a shame if, or whatever those implied threats. Is that correct?
Mr. President, can I?
Councilman, stand by. Councilman Piagentini, can you answer that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. So here's how this works. Publishing by itself personally identifiable information is not in violation of this ordinance. So you can publish somebody's social security number, their home address, where their kids go to school, and anything else, and that is not in violation of this ordinance. You can publish anything that says it would be terrible if somebody went and did horribly violent things to Anthony and his wife and his children, and that would not be in violation of this ordinance. It is only the combination of both published together that is in violation of this ordinance. So it really, you have to do both. And it actually stipulates in the ordinance too, certainly anything available via Freedom of Information Act. I mean, for example, your home address, if you buy a house, is published in the clerk's office, right? I mean, you can, whether we like it or not, most of your personally identifiable information is out there. So making that illegal by itself would be a violation of the First Amendment. It's already in the public sphere to some degree. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Mr. Councilman Blackwell. It has to be both things happening simultaneously. One or the other is not enough, and the language used must constitute the quote true threat, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Were you finished, Councilman Blackwell?
Sir, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Mulvihill.
Mr. President, is Jason still available to talk?
Councilman, I am here, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just, can you briefly talk, because it's been a little bit all over the board in terms of we've used terroristic threatening, harassed communications, and now we have doxing. Can you talk about the levels? Because in all these cases, there's got to be an intent to do something, or at least in the first two, there's got to be a criminal intent. But it's to intimidate, it's to harassed communications. But is it the same standard you're going to be looking at from the person who receives these communications And if somebody was going to observe and judge it, whether they believed it was, is it a reasonable person standard to believe they had the intent to do so? How are they different, and how do you differentiate the two? And how is it proven?
Certainly. I'll do my best, Councilman. There's a split in federal authority on whether it's the intent of the person making the threat or the person who perceives the threat that controls the intent over whether or not a threat was in fact made. And the recent guidance that was followed in the drafting of this ordinance was taken from the Connecticut Supreme Court, where they interpreted the case United States, for U.S., I won't cite this, I might get it wrong. However, they said it's neither that controls, but whether a reasonable person would consider the language used to be a threat. So the intent portion remains. You've got to intend to publish someone's personally identifiable information along with intimidating language. And so that intent is there, and whether or not that intimidating language was actually a threat is viewed by a reasonable person as to whether or not it constitutes a threat. And that would take a prosecuting attorney and a judge to make that determination.
It's similar, sorry, just to go on, Mr. President. So it would be similar to determine if somebody harassed or was harassing somebody through communications. They're also going to look at the intent, and it's going to be, could be a jury, could be a judge, could be a prosecutor to move forward with that case, correct? And also to find a disposition.
Correct. And there is, overlay on both ends. When you talk about the First Amendment and language and terroristic threatening and harassing communications, we made the distinguishment from harassing communications. Several of those matters can be considered behavior by the court. In other words, you could repeatedly dial someone, and that's going to be conduct and analyzed under conduct instead of speech. And so we left harassing out of the language of this ordinance, and we stuck with, the language that's there is going to need to be interpreted by a fact finder, a judge or a jury, and the particular set of facts that surround the offense.
Okay. But in the criminal cases, it's clearly mens rea. They have to have the intent to do it. And so there are defenses to mens rea. Mental illness, other things. I don't see any of this in ours. I was just trying to understand the differentiation between the two. And I do believe, and I don't know if we've looked at this, and maybe this is to Councilman Piagentini, I know the state, because somebody mentioned, the state, that we need to wait for the state to do it. I know the state considered a bill this year. I don't know how far it got, and I don't know if this is modeled after that at all, but I do know they were considering something similar. Thank you.
Councilman, there was legislation in the state, and that is in committee. And I don't believe it's going to make the deadline for this year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Piagentini, did you want to respond?
Well, I would just add that, yes, we were watching that, Councilman Mulvihill, and we were looking at the similarities. I actually asked Jason to sort of determine if that would make this obsolete. It frankly would have, and if I thought it was going to pass or be signed by the governor, I would have tabled this or pulled it. But as he said, at this point, I don't think there's any, because it got stuck in committee, there's no legal methodology I'll move forward this session at least.
Okay, thank you. And Councilman Ackerson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jason, I've got a question for you. We've talked about, there's the terroristic threatening, if your statute already out there. Councilman Mulvihill just brought up harassment, so I've pulled up the state criminal statute on harassment, 525.070, and that talks about, a person can be criminally guilty of harassment if a person's guilty of harassment when they, with intent to intimidate, harass, annoy, or alarm another person, he or she, if I go down here to see, in a public place makes an offensive, coarse utterance, gesture, or display, or addresses abusive language to any person. I mean, the internet is a public place, is it not?
I am here, Councilman. Thank you for the question. Again, yes, there is substantial overlay with other provisions of law. However, the ordinance was written to directly address doxing.
Which so boils down to publishing someone's home address is the difference?
The publication of that address with intimidating language.
Okay. So it boils down to, we've got criminal statutes that can prosecute threats, criminal statutes that can prosecute harassment, which is doing things that are meant to be, alarm someone or citing here specifically, engages in a course of conduct that makes an offensive coarse utterance. The only difference here is we're saying you cannot publish someone's address with the intent of trying to intimidate. Correct?
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Hollander.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think the discussion here really brings even more to the fore the argument about chilling effect of this kind of ordinance. If we're talking about how there has to be a very serious review by prosecutors, by the police department, it's very fraught with whether this could be enforced and whether anything would be a violation of this ordinance and not constitutionally protected. It seems to me that anybody who's putting something that gets anywhere close to this on the internet is going to say, well, geez, nobody knows what the law is. I heard those people debate it. And so I should just back off. And I think that's exactly what a chilling effect on First Amendment protected speech is. I'd also ask a question of Jason. Is the Brayshaw case still good law, Jason? And do you have concerns about that case being followed and being followed by Kentucky courts? And I believe that case struck down an anti-doxing law. Is that correct?
Councilman, that is correct. Brayshaw stands as good law. Florida has said the bridge is out. But that law, that court decision does not control. In Kentucky, there is no Supreme Court case or Sixth Circuit decision that has taken up Brayshaw or taken up this issue. It's a difficult lift. And I think part of the task here is to do something, to move this conversation forward.
I understand. Thank you. Thank you very much. I really just bring that point up. Councilman Piacentini has said, I've mentioned several times that other cities have addressed this. Other cities have also had their laws struck down because they passed this kind of ordinance. And there's nothing in Kentucky law or in Sixth Circuit law that says this kind of thing is constitutional. I think the chilling effect is really very significant here when we're having this kind of extended debate as to what would be covered by this law and what wouldn't be. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilwoman McCraney.
Mr. President, I move to call the question, please.
Thank you, Councilwoman.
Second.
Yep, we have a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. All right. The question has been called. Hearing no further discussion, this is an ordinance that will require a roll call vote. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Green.
No.
Councilmember Shanklin.
No.
Councilmember Dorsey.
No.
Councilmember Arthur.
No.
Councilmember Purvis.
No.
President James.
No.
Councilmember McCraney.
No.
Councilmember Armstrong.
No.
Councilmember Hollander.
No.
Councilmember Mulvihill.
Yes.
Councilmember Kramer,
Yes.
Councilmember Blackwell,
Yes.
Councilmember Fox,
Yes.
Councilmember Fowler,
Yes.
Councilmember Triplett,
Yes.
Councilmember Reed, Councilmember Winkler, Councilmember Parker,
Yes.
Councilmember Piagentini,
Yes.
Councilmember Benson,
Yes.
Councilmember George,
Yes.
Councilmember Engel,
Yes.
Councilmember Peden,
Yes.
Councilmember Flood.
Stand by 1 second. I think Councilwoman George made a mistake. 1 second.
Yes, thank you, President. I need to pay better attention. No. Yes, thank you, Councilman Piagentini.
All right.
Good catch. Ethics.
So I'm changing Councilwoman George to a no, and I have Councilman Engel as a yes, and Councilman Peden as a yes, right? Okay. And then Councilmember Flood, Councilmember Holton Stewart.
No. No.
Thank you, ma'am. Councilmember Ackerson.
No.
Mr. President, you have 12 yes and 12 no votes.
Thank you. The ordinance fails. Madam Clerk, a reading of item number 35.